The Texas sun showed no mercy in the summer of 1878, especially not for a woman alone. Out on the sprawling, unforgiving plains near the Brazos River, a story was forged not in the blaze of a six-shooter, but in the quiet courage of a lone homesteader named Cordelia Thompson. This isn't a tale of legendary gunslingers or bustling saloons. It's the true dust-and-blood account of a fateful choice made beside a rusted bear trap, a choice that would echo across the prairie. It's the story of how one woman's act of compassion, an act that could have easily cost her life, brought an entire Comanche war party to her doorstep, not as enemies, but as saviors. The silence of the plains was a living thing. It was a vast, breathing entity that Cordelia Cora May Thompson had come to know as both a comfort and a threat. It had been a year since the fever took her, Thomas leaving her with 50 acres of stubborn land, a small but sturdy sod house, a dozen head of longhorn cattle, and a loneliness so profound it felt like a permanent chill in her bones. At 28, her hands were calloused, her face browned by a sun that had no regard for her fair skin, and her eyes held the weary watchfulness of a creature constantly on alert. Her world was circumscribed by the slow bend of the Brazos River to the east and the low rolling hills to the west. This was Comanche, or what was left of it. The treaties were flimsy things, more suggestion than law, and the air was always thick with unspoken tension. Yet in her year alone, Cora had seen the Comanche only at a distance, shadowy figures on horseback, cresting a distant ridge, then vanishing as quickly as they appeared. They left her be, and she, in turn, respected the invisible lines that divided their world from hers. This particular Tuesday began like any other. The dawn broke in a riot of pink and orange, setting fire to the dew on the buffalo grass. Cora had been up since first light, milking her lone cow, checking on her small flock of chickens, and planning her day. One of her steers, a stubborn brindle with a penchant for wandering, had broken through a weak spot in the crude wire fence a day prior. She'd spent the previous afternoon patching the fence, but the animal was still missing. With a sigh, she saddled her dependable buckskin mare, Daisy packed a canteen of water and a piece of hardtack, and holstered the old Colt Patterson that had been Thomas's pride. It was heavy and awkward on her hip, a grim reminder of her solitude. She rode west toward the rocky outcrops where a steer might find shade or get itself hopelessly stuck. The sun climbed higher, beating down with a physical weight. The air shimmered with heat, and the only sounds were the creak of her leather saddle and the rhythmic plod of Daisy's hooves. She scanned the horizon, her eyes narrowed against the glare. It was in a shallow, brush-choked arroyo that she found him. But it wasn't her steer. At first it was a sound that caught her attention, a low, guttural grunt of pain quickly silenced. It was the sound of an animal trying to suffer quietly. Daisy's ears swiveled, and she let out a nervous snort, refusing to go further. Cora dismounted her hand, instinctively going to the butt of the colt. She tied Daisy's reins to a tough mesquite branch and crept forward, her boots making soft, scuffing sounds in the red dirt. The sight that met her eyes made her stomach clench. Lying partially hidden by thorny acacia bushes was a man, a Comanche warrior. His bare chest and arms were slick with sweat and streaked with dirt, his long black hair matted with blood on one side. But it was his right leg that drew a gasp from her. The jagged steel jaws of a bear trap were clamped shut just below his knee, the metal teeth sunk deep into his flesh. The ground around him was torn up, a testament to a long and desperate struggle. He had evidently tried to pry the jaws open, for his hands were raw and bleeding. A broken knife lay nearby. He was conscious, his black eyes fierce and filled with a pain so intense it was terrifying, locked onto hers. He didn't make a sound. He simply watched her, his body tensed like a cornered wolf, ready to fight to his last breath, even in this hopeless state. Cora felt a jolt of pure primal fear. This was the nightmare every settler whispered about. A lone woman and an injured warrior. The stories were always gruesome. Her first instinct was to back away, slowly get on her horse, and ride as fast as she could, back to the relative safety of her sod house. This was not her business. The trap certainly wasn't hers. She'd never owned such a cruel device. It belonged to men like Bartholomew Higgins, the brutish rancher, whose property bordered hers to the north, a man who believed the only good Comanche was a dead one. This was his doing, she was sure of it. Getting involved was inviting a world of trouble. She took a step back. The warrior's eyes followed her, and in them she saw a flicker of something beyond hatred and pain. It was a resigned sort of dignity. He was preparing to die. He began to chant softly under his breath, a low rhythmic sound that was both haunting and heartbreaking. Cora stopped. She looked at his leg, at the dark, swollen flesh around the trap's teeth. Gangrene would set in soon in this heat. A slow, agonizing death. She thought of Thomas, how he had suffered in his fever, how helpless she had felt watching him waste away. She looked back at the warrior's face, at the lines of agony etched around his mouth, at the defiant pride in his eyes. He was a man, just a man caught in a hellish machine. Damn it all, she whispered to the uncaring sky. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her gut, but something else rose to meet it, a stubborn, almost angry compassion. She wouldn't be the kind of person who left a fellow human being to die like this. Not if she could help it. She held up her empty hands, a gesture she hoped he would understand. I want to help, she said, her voice raspy. He stopped chanting. His eyes narrowed in suspicion, but he remained still, watching her every move. Slowly, deliberately, she walked back to Daisy. Her heart hammered against her ribs. He could have a hidden weapon. He could be conserving his last bit of strength to lunge at her if she got too close. From her saddlebag, she retrieved a small metal flask of whiskey, her emergency reserve, and the heavy iron pry bar she used for moving rocks and stubborn posts. When she returned, he hadn't moved. He watched the pry bar in her hand with wary intelligence. She knelt a careful distance away and unscrewed the cap of the flask. She held it out to him. He stared at it, then at her. For a long moment, the only sound was the buzz of flies. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached out a bloody hand and took the flask. He drank, his throat working. He grimaced as the harsh liquid hit his system, but drank half of it before handing it back, his gaze, never leaving her face. All right, Cora breathed more to herself than to him. This is going to hurt. She approached the trap, her mind racing. She'd seen Thomas operate a smaller version for coyotes once. It took immense pressure to open the jaws. She laid the pry bar down and examined the mechanism. It was a dual-spring model, large and powerful. She'd need leverage. I have to. Get close, she said, pointing to the trap and then to herself. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He understood. He leaned back against the dirt bank, his jaw tight, preparing for the new wave of pain. Cora positioned the tip of the pry bar between the steel jaws near the hinge. She took a deep breath, planted her feet, and put all of her weight into it. The bar barely moved. The steel was unyielding. A sob of frustration escaped her. It was too strong. The warrior grunted, then spoke in his own tongue, the words sharp and low. He pointed with his chin toward the trap's spring mechanism on one side. He then made a motion with his hand, like striking something downwards. He was telling her where to apply the pressure. not between the jaws but on the release latch for the spring. Okay, I see. She repositioned the pry bar. It was an awkward angle. She would have to lean directly over his injured leg. The scent of blood and sweat was strong. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. For a single terrifying second, she was acutely aware of her vulnerability. Her neck was exposed. If he was faking, if this was a trick, he could kill her in an instant. She looked at his face. His eyes were closed, his teeth gritted. He was trusting her as much as she was trusting him. With a cry of exertion, she threw her entire body weight onto the pry bar. The latch held for a moment, groaning in protest. Then, with a loud crack, the spring released its tension. The jaws on that side slackened. He let out a sharp hiss of pain as the movement jostled the teeth in his wound. One more, Cora panted, sweat pouring down her face and stinging her eyes. She moved to the other side and repeated the process. This time she knew what to do. She positioned the bar, took a steadying breath, and pushed down. The second spring gave way with another violent crack. The jaws of the trap fell open. He was free. He didn't move for a long moment, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Cora slumped to the ground, her arms trembling with exhaustion. The pry bar fell from her numb fingers. Slowly, painfully, the warrior pushed himself up. He looked at his leg. It was a mangled ruin of blood and torn muscle. He would not be walking on it. He looked at Cora, and his expression was unreadable. The suspicion was gone, replaced by a deep, searching gaze. He had appraised her and come to a decision. He spoke again, his voice softer now. He pointed to himself. "Tohopka," he said. It was his name. Cora, still breathing heavily, pointed to herself. "Cora." He nodded. "Cora." He looked toward the west, then back at his leg, then at her. The question was clear. What now? He was miles from his people, grievously injured and at her mercy. Cora's mind was a whirl. Leaving him here was still a death sentence. The sun, the predators, or Bart Higgins coming to check his trap would finish him. Taking him back to her homestead was an insane risk. What would her neighbors think? What would Higgins do if he found out? What if his tribe came looking for him and found him with her, misinterpreting the situation? She looked at Daisy, then back at Tohopka. Thomas had always said she had more grit than sense. She stood up and brushed the red dirt from her trousers. "All right, Tohopka," she said, her voice firm, the decision made. "Let's get you out of here." Getting him onto the horse was an agonizing ordeal. He refused to let her bear his full weight, instead, using her as a brace while he hopped on his good leg, his face a stony mask that concealed the excruciating pain he must be in. He nearly fainted when he finally settled into the saddle, slumping forward over Daisy's neck. Cora took the reins, her own steer forgotten. As she led the horse out of the arroyo, she glanced back at the monstrous trap lying open in the dust, a metal predator silenced. She had a terrible feeling that by unspringing it, she had just set a different, far more dangerous trap for herself. The journey back to the homestead was a slow, nerve-wracking procession. Cora led Daisy with one hand, her other resting on the grip of the colt, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Every dust devil looked like a rider. Every call of a hawk sounded like a signal. Tohopka was a heavy, silent presence. Behind her, occasionally shifting his weight with a barely suppressed groan. The sun was at its zenith now, a malevolent white eye in a bleached blue sky. By the time the low silhouette of her sod house and corral came into view, Cora was soaked in sweat, and her nerves were frayed to the point of breaking. She led him not to the house, but to the small windowless barn where she kept her milk cow and stored feed. It offered more concealment. Inside, the air was cooler, thick with the smell of hay and earth. With another difficult grunting effort, she helped him down from the horse. He collapsed onto a pile of clean hay. She hastily arranged his face, pale beneath its bronze skin, his breathing shallow. His leg was a catastrophe. The bleeding had slowed, but the wounds were deep and jagged, and the flesh around them was already puffing up an angry red and purple. Cora was no doctor, but she knew infection. She had seen it take livestock, and she had seen it take people. "Stay here," she commanded, in a low voice, pointing at the ground. "Do not move." His eyes, glazed with feverish pain, followed her as she hurried to the house. She returned with a bucket of precious clean water. From her strips of clean linen, she tore from a worn-out bedsheet and the bottle of carbolic acid she kept for doctoring her animals. Kneeling beside him, she hesitated. This was the point of no return. Tending to his wound was an act of intimacy, a crossing of a line that society, both white and Comanche, had drawn in blood. He watched her, his guard up again. "This will burn," she said, holding up the bottle of acid. She mimed pouring it on a cut on her own arm and flinching. He understood. He gave a single sharp nod, then gripped a fistful of hay, bracing himself. Cleaning the wounds was a grim, stomach-turning task. She had to flush out the dirt and grime, her touch as gentle as she could manage. When she poured the diluted carbolic acid into the lacerations, Tohopka's entire body went rigid. A low, ragged cry was torn from his throat, but he didn't pull away. He held absolutely still, his knuckles white, his eyes screwed shut. Cora worked quickly, her own stomach churning in sympathy. When she was done, she wrapped the leg tightly with the linen strips. It was crude, but it was the best she could do. She left him with the canteen of water and a chunk of jerky, which he looked at but didn't touch. She closed the barn doors, leaving a small crack for air, and went about her chores, her movements jerky and anxious. The world outside the barn felt menacing. The familiar landscape now seemed to hold 1,000 hiding places. That evening, the first sign of trouble arrived. It came in the form of 2 riders from the north, Bartholomew Higgins, and one of his hired hands, a lanky, vacant-eyed man named Jeb. Higgins was a bull of a man with a red, florid face and a belly that strained the buttons of his vest. He rode a big black gelding that matched his own brutish demeanor. He reined in his horse near her front porch, his eyes sweeping over her property with a proprietary air. "Afternoon, Mrs. Thompson." He boomed, his voice falsely jovial. "Mr. Higgins," Cora replied, keeping her tone flat. She stood on the porch, her arms crossed, making no move to invite him closer. "Lost one of my steers," he said, stroking his thick mustache. "Thought he might have wandered down this way." "You ain't seen a big Hereford with a brand, like a Lazy H, have you?" "No, I haven't. I've been looking for one of my own." Higgins's eyes narrowed slightly. "Is that so? Out riding today, were you west toward the arroyos?" The question was too specific. Cora's blood ran cold. He knew, or he suspected. "I was," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "No sign of him. Funny thing," Higgins went on, leaning forward on his saddle horn. "Checked one of my traps out that way. A big one. Meant for a bear that's been spooking my cattle. Trap was sprung. Empty. But there was blood. A lot of it. And tracks. Looked like a shod horse. And a moccasin print." He let the words hang in the air. Jeb, his hired hand, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, a smirk playing on his lips. "I don't know anything about your traps, mister." Higgins Cora said, her voice tighter than she wanted, "And I'd thank you to keep them off my grazing path." Higgins laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Your grazing path?" "This is all my grazing path, little lady. Or it will be. A woman's got no business trying to run a ranch out here alone. It's not safe." He looked pointedly toward the west. "All sorts of dangers." "I'm managing just fine," Cora said through clenched teeth. "Are you He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. "That well of yours must be a comfort. Best water table in this whole valley. My land's drying up. A man gets thirsty." He paused. "I made you a fair offer for this place, Mrs. Thompson. $500. It's still on the table. Be a shame if something happened to devalue the property." It was a threat, plain and simple. The well was her lifeline. Without it, the land was worthless. "The property is not for sale," Cora said, her voice ringing with finality. Higgins's face darkened. The false cheer evaporated, replaced by cold malice. "Have it your way," he snarled. He wheeled his horse around. "But when you find yourself in trouble, don't come crying to me. There's no one else to help you." He and Jeb galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a sense of dread that settled over Cora's homestead like a shroud. She hurried to the barn. Tohopka was awake, and from the tension in his body she knew he had heard every word. His hand was resting on the hilt of the knife she had left for him to cut the jerky. His eyes were clear and sharp, fixed on the barn door. He had understood the danger. The next day, Wednesday, brought the fulfillment of Higgins's threat. When Cora went to the well at dawn, the water she drew was cloudy and smelled foul. She lowered the bucket again, and this time it came up with the decomposing body of a prairie dog, its entrails spilling into the water. She wrenched her hand, flying to her mouth. He'd poisoned her well. It was a classic, cruel tactic. Cleaning it would take days, maybe weeks, and she only had 2 full barrels of clean water stored. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Higgins was not making idle threats. He was actively trying to drive her out. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Inside the barn, Tohopka's condition had worsened. The fever had taken hold. He was shivering, despite the heat, his skin hot to the touch. He was delirious, muttering in his own language, his eyes restlessly scanning the shadowy corners of the barn. Cora forced some water between his lips, but he could barely swallow. The wound on his leg was seeping the smell of infection, now undeniable. She spent the day in a state of high alert, working near the house, the heavy Colt once again on her hip. She expected Higgins to return at any moment. She felt trapped a prisoner on her own land. The act of kindness that had seemed so right and necessary 2 days ago now felt like a suicidal mistake. She had saved one man only to place herself squarely in the path of another, a man with no honor and a great deal of power. As dusk fell on that second day, she sat on her porch, watching the sky bleed into shades of purple and indigo. A profound sense of hopelessness washed over her. Higgins was right. There was no one to help her. The local sheriff in Prairie Creek, a man named Brody, was 100 miles of hard riding away, and famously ineffective against powerful ranchers like Higgins. Her nearest neighbors were miles off and kept to themselves, terrified of men like Higgins. She had made a terrible miscalculation. She had freed the warrior, and in doing so had sealed her own fate. She looked toward the barn where a man from another world lay dying. She thought of his name, Tohopka. She thought of the defiant pride in his eyes. She had saved his life, but for what? So they could both be destroyed by the same petty, greedy man. A coyote howled in the distance, a lonely, mournful sound that mirrored the ache in her own heart. The night was closing in, and Cora felt a fear deeper than any she had ever known. Thursday would be the 3rd day. She had a chilling certainty that on the 3rd day, Bartholomew Higgins would be back to finish what he had started. Miles to the west, where the plains gave way to the broken lands of the Caprock Escarpment, the camp of the Noconi Comanche, the antelope eaters, was stirring with unease. For 2 days the band had been without one of its most valued warriors. Tohopka, The wildcat had gone to scout the movements of the buffalo and had not returned. He was not a man to get lost. He knew the land as he knew the lines on his own hand. His absence was a stone dropped into the calm pool of the camp, sending ripples of concern through every tipi. On the evening of the second day, a search party returned with grim news. They had found his trail. They had found the tracks of his pony, and they had found the place where he had fought for hours against an iron enemy. They found the blood-soaked ground, the broken knife, and the tracks of a white woman's boots and her shod horse leading away from the scene. The trap was gone, but its story was written in the dirt. The news was received with a mixture of grief and rage. Grief for a warrior presumed captured or dead, and rage at the treachery of the Tejano settlers. That night, a council fire burned brightly in the center of the camp, casting flickering shadows on the grim faces of the elders and the band's war chief, a revered and formidable man named Nokona. Nokona was in his 50s, his face a roadmap of battles fought and wisdom gained. His eyes deep-set and piercing missed nothing. He listened patiently as the leader of the search party recounted their findings. The tracks lead east. The warrior finished toward the white woman's sod house by the Brazos, the one who lives alone. A murmur went through the assembled men. A lone white woman. It made no sense. Why would she take him? A captive, unlikely for a woman alone. It was a puzzle that stoked their suspicion. Into the circle stepped a broad-shouldered, powerful warrior named Makwa, which meant bear. Makwa was Tohopka's contemporary and his rival. Where Tohopka was swift and strategic, Makwa was pure force and aggression. He had long argued for driving the encroaching settlers out with fire and blood. "It is a trick," Makwa's voice boomed, silencing the murmurs. "The woman is bait. Her men the ranchers who set these vile traps are waiting. They have taken Tohopka to torture him for information or to lure us into an ambush. We have seen the white man's honor. It is a snake that bites the hand that offers peace." Many warriors grunted in agreement. Makwa's words resonated with years of broken treaties and brutal betrayals. The Tejanos were locusts consuming the land, and their word was worthless. "We should ride." Makwa continued his hand, clenching into a fist. "We should ride to this woman's house, burn it to the ground, and take back what is ours. We will show them the price for harming a Nokoni warrior." The younger warriors, eager for a fight, shouted their approval. The air crackled with war fever. Chief Nokona raised a hand, and silence fell once more. He looked around the circle, his gaze lingering on the angry faces. "Your anger is a strong horse, Makwa." Nokona said, his voice low and calm, yet carrying absolute authority. "But a strong horse with no rider gallops off a cliff. You see a trap. I see a question that has not been answered." He turned to the search party leader. "Were there signs of a struggle where the horse tracks began?" The warrior considered. "No, war chief. The tracks show the horse was led slowly. There was no sign of dragging, no sign of a fight. It was as if he went willingly." "Willingly," Makwa scoffed. "A warrior does not go willingly with his enemy. Perhaps." Nokona mused, his eyes on the fire. He did not see an enemy. The council fell silent, contemplating the chief's words. It was a strange thought. For generations, the only relationship with the settlers had been one of conflict. The idea of anything else was alien. Just then, a commotion at the edge of the camp drew their attention. A lone figure was stumbling out of the darkness, supported by 2 camp sentries. He was covered in dust, gaunt, and limping heavily, but his head was held high. A collective gasp went through the council. It was Tohopka. He had walked and crawled for nearly a day and a night. After the white woman Cora had fallen asleep from exhaustion on her porch, he had slipped out of the barn. His fever had broken during the day, leaving him weak but clear-headed. He knew he could not stay. His presence was a death sentence for her. The man Higgins would be back. He also knew his people would be worried and perhaps planning a retaliatory raid that would endanger the woman who had saved him. Using a broken branch as a crutch, he had forced his battered body on a grueling journey west, driven by a desperate urgency. He was brought before the council fire and given water. He drank deeply, then stood before his chief, swaying with exhaustion. "Tohopka." Nokona said, his voice filled with relief and surprise. "Your spirit has returned to us." "My spirit never left my chief," Tohopka said, his voice raspy. But it was nearly sent on its journey. He recounted everything, his words spare but powerful. He told them of the trap, the agonizing wait, and the arrival of the woman. He described how she had faced her fear, how she had worked to free him, not as a captive, but as a man. He told them how she had doctored his wound with her own medicine, risking her own safety to shelter him in her barn. "She didn't look at me as Comanche," Tohopka said, his gaze sweeping over the council. "She looked at me as a human being, caught and dying. Her courage was quiet, but it was as strong as the roots of an oak tree." Then his voice hardened. He told them of the arrival of the rancher Higgins. He repeated the threats he had overheard, the man's desire for the woman's land and her well. He told them of the discovery of the poisoned well that morning. "This man Higgins, he is the one who set the trap. He is a man with no honor. He fights his battles against a woman alone by poisoning her water. He will return. I saw it in his eyes. I heard it in his voice. He will return to kill her or drive her out. I came back to tell you this." Makwa stepped forward, a sneer on his face. "You speak of a white woman's honor. You were weak with fever, Tohopka. Your mind was clouded. She saved you only to save herself. She feared we would come for her. It is all trickery." "It was not trickery," Tohopka countered, his voice ringing with conviction. "I looked into her eyes. I saw fear, yes, but I also saw compassion. She gave me water when she could have left me to thirst. She cleaned my wound when she could have let the rot take me. She stood up to the fat rancher when she could have bowed her head. These are not the actions of a trickster. These are the actions of an honorable person." He turned to Nokona. "She did not ask for my help. She asked for nothing. In her world, she is as alone as a single eagle in a great storm. The man Higgins will be that storm. He will strike her down, and no one will stop him." The council was divided. The story was unbelievable. To help a settler, a Tajana woman, against another settler. It was madness. It was not their fight. Their fight was for their own survival. "Let the wolves devour each other," Makwa growled. "It is their way. It saves us the trouble." "And what of the debt?" Tohopka's voice cut through the air. "An honorable act was done for one of our people. Does the honor of the Nokoni demand we ignore it? Do we stand by and watch a brave woman be slaughtered by a coward because her skin is the color of our enemies?" He looked directly at Makwa. "Is our honor so weak that it is blinded by prejudice?" The challenge hung in the air, sharp and pointed. The question was no longer about a white woman. It was about their own identity, their own code. Chief Nokona, who had listened to the entire exchange without a word, finally rose to his feet. The firelight played across his weathered face, making his eyes seem like dark, knowing pools. "For many seasons," he began, his voice resonating with ancient authority. We have fought the Tejanos. They have taken our land, killed our buffalo, and broken their promises. Our anger is just. Our mistrust is earned. He paused, letting his gaze fall on every warrior. But we do not fight women. We do not poison wells. We do not attack the defenseless. That is the way of cowards like this Higgins. He is a blight on the land, a man who sets traps for men, as he would for beasts. He is an enemy, not just to this woman, but to the land itself, and to us. He turned his gaze to Tohopka. You say this woman acted with honor. She did, my chief. Tohopka affirmed. Nokona nodded slowly. Then the Nokoni will not be less honorable than a lone white woman. He looked out at the faces of his warriors, his expression hard as granite. Makwa is right. We will ride to the woman's house, but we will not burn it. His voice dropped, becoming as cold and deadly as a winter wind. We will be waiting. Thursday dawned heavy and oppressive. The air was still holding the promise of a brutal, sweltering day. For Cora, the rising sun brought no hope, only a grim certainty. This was the third day, the day of reckoning. Her well was useless, a source of poison instead of life. She had less than a barrel of clean water left. Her meager stores of food wouldn't last forever. But it wasn't thirst or hunger that gnawed at her. It was the suffocating certainty of violence. She had been shocked to find the barn empty at dawn. Tohopka was gone. For a fleeting, bitter moment, she felt betrayed. Had he just used her and left her to her fate? But then she saw the signs of his agonizing departure. The makeshift crutch left behind the single smeared trail of a man dragging an injured leg heading west. He hadn't abandoned her. He had removed himself as the excuse for Higgins's aggression, perhaps in a desperate attempt to save her. The gesture, though futile, touched her deeply. It also confirmed her isolation. She was now truly on her own. She didn't waste time on fear. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. Instead, she prepared. She dragged her heaviest wooden table and jammed it against the inside of the front door. She barred the single window at the back of the sod house with the iron headboard from her bed. Her home was no fortress, but a dirt-walled, grass-roofed hovel. It would not stand for long against a determined assault. She checked Thomas's old rifle, a Sharps 50-90. It was a powerful single-shot buffalo gun, accurate at long range, but slow to reload. She laid out a box of the heavy brass cartridges on the small kitchen table. Beside it, she placed the Colt Patterson. It was an older model, finicky, and less reliable than the new Peacemakers, but it was 5 shots she might desperately need. All morning, she sat in the dim interior of her house, the rifle resting across her lap. She listened. The silence of the plains was no longer a comfort. It was a canvas upon which her anxious mind painted sounds. Was that the distant thunder of hoofbeats, or just the pounding of her own blood in her ears? The attack came, not with a thunderous charge, but with a cruel, creeping malevolence. Around mid-afternoon, when the heat was at its most stupefying, she smelled smoke. Peeking through a tiny crack she had made in the window bar, she saw a pillar of black smoke rising from her barn. Higgins wasn't just coming for her. He was destroying her livelihood piece by piece. Her milk cow, her chickens, her precious store of hay, all going up in flames. A cold, hard rage replaced her fear. It settled in her stomach like a stone. She would not be smoked out like a rat. Then she heard them. 3 riders approaching not from the road, but from the south, using the riverbank as cover. It was Higgins, his smirking lackey Jeb, and another hired gun. She didn't recognize a man with a scarred face and cold, dead eyes. They carried rifles and torches. They reined in their horses 100 yards from the house, just beyond the effective range of a pistol, but well within rifle shot. "Mrs. Thompson!" Higgins's voice boomed across the clearing. It was thick with mock sympathy. "Looks like you've had a spot of bad luck. A fire, terrible thing. A woman all alone, things like this tend to happen." Cora remained silent, her knuckles white on the stock of the Sharp's rifle. "I'm a reasonable man," he shouted. "My offer still stands. $500. You sign the deed over to me and my boys, and I will be happy to escort you safely to Prairie Creek. You try to be stubborn. Well, that soddy of yours is looking mighty flammable." Jeb laughed a high-pitched, ugly sound. The scar-faced man just stared at the house, his expression unchanging. "Go to hell, Higgins." Cora's voice, when it came, was clear and steady, fired from the depths of her newfound rage. Higgins's face contorted. The pretense was over. "Wrong answer!" he spat. He raised his rifle. "Burn it." Jeb and the other man dismounted, lighting their torches from the one they'd used on the barn. They began to advance on the house from opposite sides, their intent clear. They were going to set the grass roof alight. Cora rested the long barrel of the Sharps on the windowsill, took a steadying breath, and peered down the sight. She centered the front sight on Jeb, the one who was laughing. She didn't want to kill, but she would not die. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder with the force of a mule's kick, and the roar inside the small house was deafening. Outside, Jeb screamed and dropped his torch, clutching his shoulder as he staggered back. She hadn't killed him, but she had sent a clear message. Before she could even begin, the slow process of reloading a rifle shot rang out from Higgins, splintering the wooden frame of her window, showering her with splinters. Another shot from the scar-faced man punched through the thick wooden door, burying itself in the far wall. They had her pinned. She fumbled with a fresh cartridge, her hands shaking. She ejected the spent casing and tried to slide the new one in. It was a slow, clumsy process under fire. She knew she would never get a second shot off before they reached the house. The scar-faced man was already halfway there, moving in a low crouch, his torch held high. This was it. The end. She had fought, but it was not enough. A profound, sorrowful resignation washed over her. She closed her eyes, clutching the rifle, expecting the shattering of wood and the roar of flames, and then she heard it. It was not the sound of fire. It was a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself, a high, ululating cry that ripped through the afternoon heat, followed by another and then another, until the air was filled with the terrifying, soul-shaking harmony of a Comanche war cry. Cora's eyes snapped open. She peered through the crack in the window. They came from the west, pouring over the low hills like a flood. 20, maybe 30 riders, their faces painted for war, their horses moving with liquid grace. They were armed with lances, bows, and rifles, a vision of primal, disciplined fury. At their head rode a warrior on a powerful paint horse, his face grim and determined. It was Chief Nokona. Beside him, riding with his wounded leg bound tightly to his saddle, was Tohopka. Higgins and his men froze their mouths agape. Their little war against a lone woman had suddenly become something else, entirely. The scar-faced man dropped his torch and scrambled back toward his horse. Jeb, clutching his bleeding arm, looked on in pure terror. Higgins was the first to react, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. What in God's name? He raised his rifle not at the house, but at the charging warriors, a fatal act of suicidal arrogance. The Comanche didn't slow. They split into two groups, flanking the stunned ranchers with breathtaking speed and precision. Arrows hissed through the air, thudding into the ground around Higgins's horse. The animal screamed and reared, throwing the heavy rancher to the ground. Tohopka, despite his injury, urged his horse forward. He bore down on the scar-faced man who was trying to get his rifle unslung. Tohopka didn't use a weapon. He simply rode his horse straight into the man, knocking him sprawling. Other warriors were on him in a second, disarming him. Jeb, whimpering, threw his gun down and raised his hands. All that was left was Higgins. He scrambled to his feet, his face purple with fury and fear, and drew his pistol. He fired wildly at the approaching warriors, the shots going wide. Nokona reined in his horse a few feet from him. He looked down at the sputtering, dirt-covered rancher with an expression of pure contempt. He didn't raise a weapon. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. Higgins's bluff crumbled. The pistol fell from his limp hand. He was surrounded, his pathetic two-man army neutralized in seconds. The plains, which he had considered his kingdom, had just reminded him who its true masters were. From inside her house, Cora watched, breathless. She slowly lowered the heavy Sharps rifle. The battle was over before she had even chambered her second round. The war party wasn't attacking her. They weren't a random force of destruction. They had come for her. They had come to her. The siege was broken. The silence that descended was more profound than any that had come before, broken only by the crackle of the burning barn and the nervous stamping of the Comanche ponies. The third day had come, but it had not ended, as she or Bartholomew Higgins had expected. The aftermath of the confrontation was eerily quiet. The Comanche warriors formed a loose, silent circle around Cora's homestead, their painted faces impassive, their gaze missing nothing. They were a living wall, a temporary boundary between her small, violated world and the larger hostile one beyond. Higgins and his two men were efficiently bound with their own ropes, their expressions a mixture of terror and disbelief. Makwa, the fierce warrior who had argued against helping, was the one who personally disarmed Higgins, his movements rough and full of a disdain that was almost poetic in its justice. He looked from the bound, whimpering rancher to Cora's small, defiant home, and a flicker of understanding, or perhaps respect, crossed his face for the first time. Slowly Cora unbarred her door. She pushed the heavy table aside and stepped out onto her porch, blinking in the harsh afternoon light. She was still clutching the Sharps rifle, though its barrel was now pointed at the ground. Her eyes sought out one man. Tohopka, dismounted, wincing as his weight came down on his good leg. He leaned heavily on his horse for support, but his gaze was steady as he met hers across the dusty yard. There were no words that could encompass the moment. A shared look of profound, exhausted gratitude passed between them. He had kept his unspoken promise. Chief Nokona walked his horse forward, stopping directly in front of her porch. He was an intimidating figure, the very embodiment of the wild, untamable spirit of the land. He looked at the smoking ruin of her barn, at the bullet splintering her window frame, and then at her. He saw not a frightened woman, but a fighter who had been prepared to stand her ground. He spoke in the Comanche tongue, his voice a low rumble. Tohopka translated his English, careful and spare. The chief says, "The man who sets traps for men is a coward. The land does not weep for a coward's fate." Cora nodded, finding her voice. "He would have killed me. For my water. For my land." Tohopka translated. Nokona listened, his expression unchanging. He spoke again. He says, "Your water is your own. Your land is your own. This pest." Tohopka struggled for the right word, gesturing to Higgins, "will trouble you no more." What that meant, Cora didn't ask. She didn't need to. The fate of Higgins and his men would be decided by Comanche justice, far from any white man's law. She looked at the three captives now being hauled onto their own horses, their future a terrifying unknown. She felt no pity. Nokona then held up a hand and pointed at her, then at the rifle in her grasp. He spoke a single word, Tohopka translated it. Brave. It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact, an observation from one warrior to another. In that moment, the chasm between their two worlds seemed to shrink. They were not settler and native woman and man. They were two people who understood what it meant to defend one's home. Cora gave a small, weary nod of acknowledgement. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. You saved my life." When Tohopka translated this, Nokona simply inclined his head. The debt was paid. Honor had been satisfied. The Comanche did not linger. Their purpose was served. With a silent command from their chief, the war party began to move out, taking their prisoners with them. Tohopka was the last to leave. He paused his horse beside her porch. "You're well," he said. "The animal. We can help." Cora shook her head. "I can manage it. You need to tend to your leg." He looked at her a long, searching look. "You are strong, Cora Thompson." He said her name as one word, a title of respect. "But you are one person. The prairie does not favor those who are alone." He reached into a pouch at his side and pulled out a single beautifully crafted arrowhead made of black flint. He held it out to her. "If the trouble returns," he said, "place this on the flat rock on the hill to the west, the one that looks like a sleeping coyote. We will see it." Cora took the arrowhead. It was cool and smooth in her hand, a tangible symbol of the impossible thing that had just happened. "I hope I never have to use it," she said softly. Tohopka nodded. "So do I." With that, he turned his horse and galloped to catch up with his departing tribe. Cora stood on her porch, the arrowhead clutched in her hand, and watched until they were just shimmering specks of dust against the setting sun. She was alone again, surrounded by the ruins of her barn and the silence of the plains. But the silence was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the echo of war cries and the memory of an honor that transcended blood and boundary. She was still alone, but she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that she was no longer without allies. That day, the story of Cordelia Thompson became a quiet legend, whispered not in the saloons of bustling towns, but carried on the wind across the Texas plains. It wasn't a story about conquest or riches, but about something far more rare, a bridge of respect built between two worlds, locked in conflict. It speaks to a truth we often forget, that courage isn't always loud, and alliances can be found in the most unexpected of places. The tale reminds us that honor is a language understood by all, and that a single act of fearless compassion can change the course of a life, or even a piece of history forever. If this story of raw courage and an unlikely bond resonated with you, and if you believe that tales like these from the dusty annals of the past deserve to be told, then please help us keep them alive. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more forgotten legends from the Wild West. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these incredible true stories of the human spirit. Thank you for listening.